Welcome back to Bombastic Nation, a ting. Back with some more vibes for all you. Yes, I'm Mr. Giant. And somebody suggested that, do some African American history stuff, you know what I mean? So I decided, well, let's go for it, you know what I mean? I know a lot about it, but, from a historical standpoint and thing, not too much. So I decided I'm going to go ahead and watch this here. Thanks for the suggestions. Thank you all for all the suggestions. Thank you for all the comments and things like that. And don't forget that. I'm doing extras too, you know what I mean? Like mythical creatures from in history, a little bit of ghost stories from history and stuff like that. I'm gonna be doing that. Those are extra in accordance with the regular uploads. So go ahead and when you subscribe, make sure you hit the notification button so you're gonna know when I'm putting up those videos and things. You don't miss nothing from the giant. You don't miss a bloody thing from the giant. You understand what I said thing? But anyway, this one is called History of African Americans, Past to Future. So we're gonna go ahead and take a look at this and see what this is all about. Let's YouTube and simmer.
History of African Americans. African Americans account for a large portion of the American population. At the turn of the 21st century, there were 36 million African Americans in the South, 2 million in New York City, 1 million in Chicago, and around 500,000 to 1 million African Americans living in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Houston. Early history of African Americans. History of African Americans began when 20 Africans were dropped in the English colony of Virginia in 1619. They worked as indentured servants who were bound to an employer for a limited number of years. Their population kept growing and reached 760,000 in 1790. Most of them were directly imported from Africa or were the children of slave mothers, accounting for 1/5 of the population of the United States. The blacks were documented into slavery in Virginia in 1661 and all the English colonies by 1750. During that time, they were considered an inferior race with heathen culture. They were forced to work in the farmlands of the New World. Africans were sold as merchandise by European traders on slave ships across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies, the region of the North Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean. At least 1/6 of them died during the journey due to shock, disease, and suicide. Slavery in America. During the period of the 17th and 18th centuries, Africans and African Americans, referring to those born in the New World, were forced to work as slaves on tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the southern coast, from the Chesapeake Bay colonies of Maryland and Virginia south to Georgia. Eventually, slavery became rooted in the South's huge cotton and sugar plantations. Legislation was passed by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807 to end the slave trade in America. However, it did nothing but boosted the domestic slave trade in the country. Black women were forced to conceive as early as age 13 and to give birth as often as possible. There were still free black people making up 1/10 of the entire African American population. They originated with former indentured servants and their descendants. Some of them migrated from the West Indies or were freed by their owners. But while in the South, they were subject to restrictions.
So according to what he's saying here, they were brought in as indentured servants first, and then as slaves. It's crazy how, and this happens with everybody, how people get dehumanized. Because and it's like every race, a certain race will dehumanize another race, and it's crazy how we dehumanize each other. How could we look at another human being and says you're not human? And I'm not talking because to be real, I hear some people calling white people white devils here, which is a form of dehumanization. So races dehumanize each other. How should I put this? The reasons for the dehumanization might be different. Dehumanization to make forced labor. Dehumanization because of the treatment. You know what I mean? You have to dehumanize people in order to understand why they treat you the way they treat you. You know what I mean? But we seem to like to dehumanize each other. And I'll be honest with you, man. These days, it doesn't. People aren't acting like humans anymore. These days, nobody. Period. You know what I mean? There's no compassion. There is, I guess, but it's not evident. You know what I mean? It's mainly a compassion based on what you believe, compassion based on what your religious preference is, compassion based on what your political affiliation is. And I'm talking about here. In the rest of the world, you all tell me, you all from all over the world, comment down in the comment section, tell me if that's what you're feeling. If you're into the peace and love and everybody's equal stuff, tell me if that's not what you're feeling. Because in a way, that's what I'm feeling. Where I am. Where you are, let the brethren know.
Restrictions imposed on slaves. In the North, they were not allowed to vote, own any property, and travel freely. They even faced the risks of being kidnapped and enslaved. Movements to end slavery. Abolitionists in Britain and the United States in the 1840 to 1860 period developed large, complex propaganda campaigns against slavery. Among the free blacks in the North were emerging African American leaders.
You see, he said in 1840 to 1860, the slave trade was abolished in the Caribbean in 1833. And I think here in America in 1863. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong in the bottom. And so I guess this is about America. Maybe I should do one about the history of Africans in the West Indies or in the Caribbean also.
Leaders in many states, such as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. They initially held national and state conventions in early 1830. However, these people shared different opinions on how to deal with slavery and discrimination. Several leaders encouraged slaves to revolt and overthrow their masters, while others thought they should enhance the economy and establish a modern black country in Africa. Thus, African Americans founded Liberia in West Africa, which foreshadowed the development of Pan-African nationalism. American Civil War. According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, there must be an equal number of slave and free states, but this was abrogated, leading to slavery in all American territory. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of America on the anti-slavery platform of the new Republican Party. At the beginning of 1861, a movement was launched in an attempt to liberate all the country's slaves. It was the Civil War. However, the initial goal of Lincoln was not to abort slavery, but to emancipate gradually, with the federal government compensating the slaveholders for the loss of their property. But in September of 1862, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that all slaves were to be free.
Isn't that funny? They're going to compensate the plantation owners. But how is that different from now when they compensate corporations? You know what I mean? Giving them big tax breaks, giving them the bigger portion of the subsidies and stuff, or what do they call it? What did they just have? Oh my goodness! Well, they were giving money to people. They got the bigger chunk of it. The corporations and the rich people, they got the bigger chunk of it. Straight up, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like the same thing. It's kind of like the same thing. Only this time they have a whole bunch of working slaves, both black and white. You know what I mean? Because man, you working from day to day, paycheck to paycheck, and businesses are like they're not mom and pop businesses, but like corporations are like bam, bam, bam on you. One person is doing 10 different jobs. Like for instance, when I first started working here, every company, every retail store out of a corporation had a maintenance guy. They're gone, and they just have the other workers do the cleaning and stuff like that, cleaning the bathrooms and all of that. You know what I mean? So they're streamlining, and they're packing more work on people that are there so that they could maximize their profit. So they're working slaves, man. People always like, be thankful for the job you have. But you're struggling to pay your bills. You're working paycheck to paycheck. You know what I mean? You can't afford to get school supplies for your kids. And I mean, maybe it's really bad where I am here because it's one of the poorest states in the union. But still, you know what I mean? Like, I know people I work with have 3 and 4 jobs and still can't make ends meet. It's like you're working slave. You're working all the time, and then they would cut your hours. You know what I mean? Like you'll be getting like 30 hours, 35 hours one week, and next week 15 hours. You know what I mean? We gotta cut the hours and stuff like that. While you know what? Let me tell you a story. I was working at this certain toy store, and the manager was really humane type of dude. You know, was a friend of mine's, and the corporate headquarters, send down a whole bunch of hours. So he started giving the workers that were already there the hours, and the corporation said, no, don't give them the hours. Hire more people and give them the hours. And he said, well, when you cut the hours, what are we going to do? Just don't give them hours. So it's yeah. Granted, you could do stuff and have a little mode, and the slaves they did back then, and you're not getting whipped and stuff. You're getting mentally beat down, psychologically beat down. I mean, people are so stressed out. You know what I mean? And trust me, I'm struggling with it myself too. You know what I mean? I've been grumpy lately, but let's get back to the story. I'm babbling too much.
Making the Civil War a war to end slavery. African Americans after the Civil War. After the Civil War, nearly 4 million slaves were freed, gained their citizenship, and the right to vote by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, respectively. However, all of these new provisions were ignored, especially in the South. During Reconstruction, with leadership from educated African Americans from the North and abroad, they gradually wielded political power in the South. However, it didn't last long due to economic pressure and violent anti-black activities, such as ones from the Ku Klux Klan. The white supremacy once again dominated, leading to racial separation all over the southern states. In the post-Reconstruction years, both African Americans in the South and the North struggled to...
I tell you what, man, I've seen a Klan march, and that happened to me like couple of years after I came to this country. I used to see this stuff in newsreels and movies and stuff, but actually seeing them walking through the streets with that pointy hat and stuff, I actually witnessed that firsthand. Now, luckily, the people in the small town where it was happening was predominantly white, right? But luckily, a lot of the white people in that town was like, not here with that, get out of there, you know what I mean? So it wasn't that crazy, but wow, that was surreal. It was like being in a movie for me. Now, for people who have experienced it before, and it's like I wouldn't say a regular thing, but an eminent thing that's in there. But for me, it was like, it's real.
To find a job, so many of them decided to migrate westward. Impacts of World War I. In 1900, nearly 8 million African Americans still lived in the South. However, due to economic depression, more African Americans moved northwards and were then embroiled in World War I. During the war, thousands of black officers were commissioned, and many served abroad in labor battalions and service regiments. In 1919, the Universal Negro Improvement Association was established in the Harlem district of New York City by Marcus Garvey, a black nationalist born in Jamaica.
Yeah, Marcus.
1,000 members, it is considered to be the largest mass movement of African Americans in the country's history. Garvey's movement ceased after he was jailed and deported to his home country. The Great Depression. Due to the Great Depression of the 1930s, a large number of African Americans lost their jobs amidst inherent discrimination. Virtually ignored by the Republican administrations of the 1920s, black voters drifted to the Democratic Party, especially in the northern cities. They supported Democratic candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1932 presidential race, with the establishment of the New Deal reforms. African Americans were aided with low-cost public housing, education, and more jobs. Impacts of World War II. The outbreak of World War II, along with the industrial boom, put an end to the Depression in 1939. With support from President Roosevelt, African Americans secured more jobs at better wages during the war. More and more blacks migrated from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, which was known as the Great Migration. However, due to culminating job competition along with serious housing shortages, race riots broke out in many areas. The worst occurred in Detroit in June 1943. During the war, a large portion of African American soldiers overseas were in service units and combat troops remained segregated, but then integrated officer training was subject to ratification. In 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, the armed services finally adopted a policy of full integration. The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was the persistent and deliberate step of African Americans in the 1940s and 1950s. Direct, nonviolent action by African Americans achieved several successes, such as the bus boycott of 1955 to 56, led by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in Alabama, student sit-ins movement in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, and freedom rides in Alabama, Mississippi to defy segregation on interstate buses in 1961, Freedom Now Party in Michigan in 1964, and national attention in the spring of 1963 in Alabama. Within 15 years after the Supreme Court prescribed all-white primary elections in 1944, the number of the registered black electorate in the South increased more than fivefold, reaching 1.25 million in 1958. The culmination of the Civil Rights Movement was in 1963, when King addressed the crowd of about
I have a dream.
2,000 demonstrators gathered on the Mall for Lincoln Memorial. The march aided in securing the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in voting, public accommodations, and employment. Post-Civil Rights era of African American history. In 1989, Douglas Wilder became the first African American elected governor in U.S. history. In 1992, Carol Moseley Braun
1989.
became the first black woman elected to the U.S. Senate.
1992.
There were 8,936 black office holders in the United States in 2000, showing a net increase of 7,467 since 1970. In 2001, there were 484 black males. The 39 African American members of Congress form the Congressional Black Caucus, which serves as a political bloc for issues relating to African Americans. The appointment of blacks to high federal offices, including General Colin Powell, chairman of the U.S. Armed Forces Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1989 to 93, United States Secretary of State, 2001 to 05, Condoleezza Rice, Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, 2001 to 04, Secretary of State in 2005 to 09, Ron Brown, United States Secretary of Commerce, 1993 to 96, and Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas, also demonstrates the increasing visibility of blacks in the political arena. The dramatic political breakthrough came in the 2008 election, with the election of Barack Obama, the son of a black Kenyan father and a white American mother. He won overwhelming support from African American voters in the Democratic primaries, even as his main opponent, Hillary Clinton, had the support of many black politicians. The post-civil rights era is also notable for the new Great Migration, in which millions of African Americans have returned to the South, including Texas, Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, often to pursue increased economic opportunities in now desegregated southern cities. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more videos of history.
Wow. That was quite succinct. You know what I mean? That was quite succinct. I totally enjoyed that. Let me stop this here. I don't know what this thing is doing, but it is getting on my nerves here, so you know what I mean. But that was quite succinct, and I'm glad I watched it. You know, a lot of it I knew already, and but you know, have it done chronologically like that. I've never had it done like that before, but it definitely was interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and remember, go out there, learn about a stranger, and take care of each other. All right, cool runnings.